Marcus King had always enjoyed his quiet evenings. After a long day of work, nothing felt better than kicking back in his backyard hammock with a cold beer in one hand and his loyal dog, Duke, lounging beside him. The warm summer breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead, and the sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of peace he had worked hard to earn when he bought this house a year ago. But peace never lasted long when Karen Wright lived next door. The distant wail of sirens cut through the evening calm, growing louder by the second. Marcus frowned, sitting up slightly. He glanced toward the street beyond his wooden fence, his gut twisting with unease. Duke lifted his head, ears perked up. The dog had grown used to disturbances ever since they moved in, but something about this moment felt different. Then came the flashing red and blue lights. A police car pulled up in front of his house, and two officers stepped out, their expressions serious but not hostile. Marcus swung his legs over the side of the hammock, placing his beer down on the small patio table. His gut told him he was about to deal with something ridiculous, and sure enough, a shrill, all-too-familiar voice rang out before he could even get a word in. "That's him, officer. That man is trespassing on my property." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand down his face before turning toward the voice. Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, her mouth set in a smug line of satisfaction. Her brother, Chad, lingered awkwardly beside her, shifting on his feet like he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of this. One of the officers, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward. "Sir, are you Marcus King?" "Yeah," Marcus said, standing up. "And this is my house." Karen scoffed loudly. "Lies! That house has never belonged to him. I told him to leave, but he refuses." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "That's funny. I don't remember seeing your name on the deed." The officer raised an eyebrow, glancing between them. "Ma'am, you're saying he's trespassing?" "Yes. I've lived in this neighborhood for years, and I know everyone who belongs here. He does not." Duke let out a low growl as if he could sense the tension in the air. Marcus reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears to keep him calm. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay level-headed. "Officer, I have proof that I own this house," he said. "If you give me a second, I can show you." Karen threw her hands in the air. "Oh, please, he probably faked whatever he's about to show you." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, let's not jump to conclusions. Sir, if you have proof of ownership, please show us." Marcus pulled out his phone, already knowing this wasn't going to end without a fight. Marcus unlocked his phone with a practiced swipe, scrolling through his documents as the tension in the air thickened. The officers stood patiently, though one of them exchanged a look with his partner, clearly aware that this was about to be a waste of their time. Meanwhile, Karen huffed loudly, arms still crossed, tapping her foot like she had anywhere better to be. Duke sat beside Marcus, watching the scene unfold with an alert but calm expression. He wasn't a barking dog, but he had a presence that made people think twice before doing anything too reckless. Marcus appreciated that about him. Finally, he found what he was looking for. He held up the screen, displaying the official deed with his name printed in bold letters. "Here. This is my house. I bought it a year ago. It's all legal and documented." The officer with the beard leaned in, inspecting the document closely. He gave a nod before turning to Karen. "Ma'am, this paperwork confirms that Mr. King owns this property. Do you have anything that disputes this claim?" Karen's smug expression faltered for just a second before she scoffed again. "Oh, so now you just believe a piece of paper? For all we know, that could be fake. People fake things all the time." Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose, gripping his phone a little tighter. "Are you serious right now?" Chad, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat awkwardly. Karen, maybe we should just drop this. I mean, if he's got proof and everything." Karen spun on her brother so fast that he took a step back. "Are you taking his side?" she snapped. "You always do this, Chad. You never support me." "It's not about sides," Chad muttered. "It's about facts." The officers looked at each other again before the second one finally spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, without any evidence to support your claim, there's nothing we can do. Mr. King has provided legal proof of ownership. If you continue making false reports, we may have to cite you for wasting police resources." Karen's face turned red. Her mouth opened and closed like she was scrambling for another argument, but the warning in the officer's voice must have sunk in. She huffed dramatically, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath. "You don't belong here." Marcus met her glare with a steady, unbothered look. "I'm not going anywhere." With one last scoff, Karen turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house, muttering under her breath the whole way. Chad hesitated, shooting Marcus a half-apologetic glance before following after her. The officers turned back to Marcus. "Sorry for the trouble, sir," the bearded one said. "We see cases like this sometimes." Marcus nodded, pocketing his phone. "I figured. Thanks for handling it professionally." As the officers got back in their car, Marcus glanced down at Duke, who wagged his tail once. "Looks like we're in for a fun time here, buddy," Marcus muttered. "Guess we better buckle up." The sun had barely started to set when Marcus decided he needed to clear his head. The whole ordeal with Karen had left a bad taste in his mouth, but he refused to let it ruin his day. This was his home, and he wasn't going to let some bitter neighbor make him feel otherwise. He grabbed Duke's leash, and the dog immediately perked up, ears twitching in excitement. "You ready, boy?" Marcus asked, clipping it onto his collar. Duke let out a small woof, tail wagging furiously as he led the way to the front door. Stepping outside, Marcus took a deep breath. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and barbecue from a few houses down. This neighborhood, despite its problems, had a charm to it. He wanted to focus on that instead of the negativity. As he started walking down the sidewalk, he noticed a few neighbors out and about. An older couple was tending to their garden, carefully trimming the rose bushes. A group of kids rode their bikes up and down the street, their laughter echoing through the air. It was a peaceful evening, at least for most people. Marcus was about to turn the corner when he spotted Chad sitting alone on his front porch. The guy looked deep in thought, picking at the label of a sweating beer bottle. He didn't seem to notice Marcus at first, but when Duke let out a soft bark, Chad's head snapped up. There was a beat of silence before Marcus nodded in greeting. "Hey." Chad hesitated, then gave a small nod back. "Hey, man." His voice lacked the usual arrogance that came out when he was with Karen. Instead, he sounded tired. Marcus debated for a second before stepping closer. "Mind if I sit?" Chad blinked in surprise, but shrugged. "Yeah, sure. It's your neighborhood too, right?" There was no sarcasm in his tone, just a quiet acceptance. Marcus took a seat on the porch steps, keeping a comfortable distance. Duke sat beside him, resting his head on his paws. For a moment, they both just sat there, watching the neighborhood carry on as if nothing had happened earlier. Chad exhaled sharply. "Look, man, about my sister." Marcus tilted his head, waiting. "She's stubborn," Chad continued, running a hand through his hair. "She thinks she's protecting something, but half the time, I don't even know what that is." He let out a bitter chuckle. "She's been like this ever since our dad passed, always looking for a fight, always trying to prove something." Marcus listened, not interrupting. Chad took another swig of his beer before shaking his head. "I don't agree with her, all right? I know what she did was messed up. I don't know how to stop her when she gets like that." Marcus finally spoke. "Then maybe it's time you stop trying to defend her." Chad looked down at his drink, silent for a long moment. "Yeah," he muttered. "Maybe it is." Marcus sat on his porch, running his fingers through Duke's fur as the night settled in. The confrontation with Karen still lingered in his mind, but his talk with Chad had given him something new to think about. Maybe Karen wasn't just a bitter, controlling neighbor. Maybe she was someone who had been fighting for so long that she didn't know how to stop. Still, that didn't make what she did okay. Duke let out a small huff, nudging Marcus's hand as if sensing his frustration. He gave the dog a small smile and scratched behind his ears. "You always know when something's up, don't you?" The street was quieter now, the last few kids having gone inside for the night. Porch lights flickered on, casting warm glows across neatly trimmed lawns. Marcus had always liked this time of evening, when the world slowed down just enough for him to breathe. His peace was short-lived, though. A sharp knock on his front door made him turn. He wasn't expecting anyone. Standing up, he gave Duke a quick signal to stay before heading inside. As he approached the door, he hesitated for a second, then pulled it open. Karen stood on his doorstep. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She wasn't wearing the same hostility she usually did, but there was still tension in the air. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you'd be knocking on my door. Karen let out a breath, shifting her weight. Look, She stopped, as if reconsidering her words. Chad told me you two talked. Marcus nodded. Yeah, we did. She exhaled sharply, looking away for a moment before meeting his eyes again. I shouldn't have done that earlier. Taking your mail. I was out of line. Marcus studied her. He hadn't expected an apology. Not from her. Yeah, he said, you were. Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She hesitated, then finally sighed. I've lived here my whole life. I watched this neighborhood change, watched people come and go, some for the better, some not. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. And you thought I wasn't one of the better ones? Karen gave him a look. I don't know you. And you never tried to. She was silent at that. Duke padded up behind Marcus, sniffing at the air before letting out a soft whine. Karen's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Marcus. I don't expect us to be friends, she said finally, but I don't want to be enemies either. Marcus considered her words. After everything, he still wasn't sure if he could trust her, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. We'll see, he said. Karen gave a small nod before turning and walking away. Marcus watched Karen retreat down the porch steps, her shoulders tense but her pace steady. He hadn't expected her to apologize, hadn't even thought she was capable of it. She was the type to hold her ground, to dig her heels in even when she was wrong. That was the Karen he knew. But tonight, she'd been different. Not exactly warm, but at least human. He wasn't sure if it was Chad's influence or something else, but it was enough to make Marcus pause. Duke brushed against his leg, his tail wagging slightly as he watched Karen disappear down the street. Marcus ran a hand through his fur absent-mindedly, his mind still processing what had just happened. He'd spent so much time seeing Karen as the enemy that it was strange to consider she might not be as simple as he thought. Still, an apology wasn't a solution. Marcus sighed and stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. The living room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He sat down on the couch, rubbing his face. He wasn't even sure why he cared so much. Maybe it was the principle of it. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet Karen had made him feel like an outsider from the moment he moved in. He wasn't the first to get that treatment either. She had a history of this. Marcus leaned back, staring at the ceiling. If this neighborhood was so important to her, why did she spend so much time driving people away? Chad had said she'd been here forever, that she'd seen it change. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe she was holding on too tightly to something that didn't exist anymore. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His muscles tensed. He hadn't expected another visitor tonight. He hesitated before standing, moving cautiously to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Chad standing there, hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels. Figured you might need a drink, Chad said, lifting a six-pack of beer. Marcus huffed a small laugh and stepped aside. Guess you heard Karen came by. Oh yeah, Chad said, walking in and setting the beers down on the coffee table. She didn't say much, but I could tell something was on her mind. He popped open a can and handed one to Marcus. So how'd it go? Marcus sat back down, taking a sip before answering. Weird, he admitted. She apologized? Kind of. Said she didn't want to be enemies. Chad nodded slowly. That's big for her. That's what worries me, Marcus said, shaking his head. Why now? She's been a pain in my ass since I moved in. What changed? Chad leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, man, Karen's got a lot of walls up, always has. She lost a lot over the years, family, friends, people she thought would always be here. I'm not making excuses for her, but I think she's scared of losing whatever control she has left. Marcus frowned, considering Chad's words. Control over what, though? This neighborhood? The people in it? Chad exhaled, shaking his head. It's not about control the way you're thinking. It's about stability. She's seen too many things change, too many people leave. She tries to keep things the same, but that's impossible. He took a sip of his beer, and deep down, I think she knows that. Marcus let out a slow breath. Maybe Chad was right. Maybe Karen wasn't just being difficult for the sake of it, but that didn't erase the way she'd treated him. So what am I supposed to do? Marcus asked. Just let it go? Chad shrugged. That's up to you. But if she's making an effort, maybe it's worth meeting her halfway. Marcus wasn't sure if he could do that. The rest of the night passed with easy conversation, shifting away from Karen and onto lighter topics. By the time Chad left, Marcus felt a little lighter himself. Maybe it was the beer, or maybe it was just nice to talk to someone who got it. The next morning, Marcus was up early, taking Duke for a walk through the neighborhood. The sun was still rising, casting soft golden light over the quiet streets. It was peaceful, the kind of morning that made him appreciate being here. As he rounded the corner near Karen's house, he noticed her out front, tending to her flower beds. She looked up as he passed, and for a moment he thought she might ignore him. Instead, she gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was something. Marcus nodded back before continuing his walk. Maybe they'd never be friends, maybe there would always be tension between them, but for the first time since he moved in, he felt like they weren't at war. And for now, that was enough.